Good morning.
Good morning, Precious. Just looking forward to this.
So am I. I've been looking forward to this for some time, actually. Yeah. These are really interesting times that we're living in. And by interesting, I think it's a time of flux, and the world as we know it is going to have a look and feel that's different from last year, for example. I don't know. What do you think?
Listening to the introduction, and we're still on coffee time this morning, but it has a kind of the way this conversation is introduced, the way in which we now encounter each other, really for the first time. We haven't spoken before, though, well, at least for my side, I really wanted to. And in the context of this project, things feel quite cosmic, you know, like an encounter. And there's obviously something really kind of outer spacey about this project, and one feel that those are like encounters in a kind of somehow like infinite possibilities of encounters. No, so who knows why we two were put together? No, is it some kind of internal Longplayer algorithm or a curator's choice? But it feels like those encounters are the kind of all the possible conversation. Imagine actually all the possible conversations that could be made between two people who don't know each other.
Yeah.
How long would it take for everybody in the world to speak to everybody else for half an hour?
Yeah, and I mean, right now, because of COVID, we are all feeling under the same, we all feel as if we're living under the sort of same looming question of how long is COVID going to be here? What effect is it going to have on us? And yeah, listening to the questions earlier, as human beings, is so easy to think of the moment and the now, and think in terms of our lifespans, and we sort of rush around, not really thinking about the long term, and the future. And when you look at, so when COVID happened, so I'm an epidemiologist, and I was looking through the timelines and remembering, because it's one thing to study something and another to be living it. And when you look throughout history, epidemics and pandemics happen. And the question is, over the longer period of time, what are the progressions? What are the lessons are we learning? As learning as human beings, and I think, for me, this has been a reminder of our humanity, and the fragility of our humanity, and the importance of community and coming together. So I've only just met you, but we were already connected before we met.
I think that, the logic of the pandemic, in which a connection between two people could be fatal, right? A virus could be passed, and then a connection between one of those persons and another, and then all this sort of R factor exponential increase in the number. So I agree. So on the one hand, you feel all of a sudden the concept of humanity becomes material, becomes tangible. It's not simply a kind of an abstract idea. It is the community of the vulnerable, and those communities that are, in a sense, compatible in a way that the virus could pass from one to the other. And I think that the relation, what is interesting, I think, also in this piece of music, and if you connect it to epidemiology, perhaps, I don't know, you're an epidemiologist, so you can tell me more, but where the moment of a present, when an incident, when an encounter could be determining so much about how your life would be, um, would evolve. And I keep on thinking about this first moment when the virus could have jumped the species line, whether it was bat or pangolin,
Mm.
and moved to the first human that encountered it. That kind of microscopic scale, this micro temporality in which it occurs becomes such a determinant factor on the future that makes me think that, when we think about future, we think about this huge expanses of time, this abstract canvas on which we can like draw our desires for peace and prosperity and equality and equity. But in fact, every moment holds within it, every incident, every encounter holds within it so many potential futures. And I think that that is something that so bizarre that a pangolin, a human, a bat, or whatever happened there at that very like first moment, that sort of big bang of this virus, could have gone in that way, could have gone in another way, and we are living within the future of that moment. So I think that this kind of shows me that, when you think about the future, it's not an abstract thought. It's a very material thought that is grounded in moments of encounter.
Yeah, and also how these instances, these moments are happening all the time, right? And every once in a while, they make a big splash, and we're living through this big splash. And with the closure of borders, so March, April, with all these borders closed, people not moving, I was taking sort of walks in the countryside, and many more animals, hedgehogs that I hadn't seen, because we didn't have so many cars running them over. And again, that connectedness, how as human beings, our activities have these impacts, not just to other human beings, be it a virus passing from a person to another, but also the habitats, food sources, and again, we are a piece in that connected network. So there's a communities of other human beings, but there is this more global connectedness of the ecosystem, and how it's important to realize how our actions impact that ecosystem, the insects, the snakes, we think that what happened was we interacted too closely. We think it was the wet markets of us having that close interactions with all these animals that would normally be maybe further apart and not so close to us. And then it triggered this now pandemic that will probably be with us for quite some time.
So I know, Precious, that you're an epidemiologist, and there's something, there's the obviously now epidemiology is in everybody's mind, but I think a year ago, many people didn't know even how to pronounce this term.
Yes.
So all of a sudden, it's there's something really that I admired about the conception of health and the conception of interconnectedness that epidemiology has in relation to other form of medicine, and also in relation to forensics, which is something that I'm dealing with. Because to my understanding, and you correct me as the expert on the field, the and it has a very interesting corollary with the way that my political imagination works, and the way also my kind of concept of the future maybe that think about health as something that is collective, that is relational, that is environmental. So, in a way that sometimes kind of individual forensics or medical medicine is practiced, it kind of seen the body as an autarkic unit that has something to fix within or not. Whereas I always thought that epidemiology is our relation to the built environment, the environment that we create as humans, the sort of Anthropocene, let's say, this planet that we've built ourselves rather than inhabit. Our relationship to each other, our relationship to ocean currents and weather and all sort of like things that are much bigger than a single individual. So epidemiology seems to turn a kind of a way of mapping health as a collective and therefore as a political category. And of course, when one thinks about politics and one thinks about some of the bad ways in which liberalism was interpreted as the rights of an individual, looking at an individual as the kind of the smallest unit of reference, rather than looking at collective rights of people, population, the rights of environment, right of people with environment. So it seems to me that there is something that we can take from this moment, relying on epidemiology in the expanded sense as a kind of set of relations, and build a future that is much more integrated with our environment. And you mentioned it when you described you walking through the English wilderness now, I wonder if I have a maybe too romantic a view of epidemiology, or if that's resonate.
It does resonate because it's messy, it's complex, right? Because there are so many determinants, social, economic determinants of health, and the aspects of what is the definition. It's not just about disease, it's about our well-being, it's about mental wellness. It's a much richer definition, and so it does mean that we have to take in so much into consideration, which of course also makes it more complex to interpret. And so people want a sort of reductionist approach where, if we can say, if you're exposed to a virus, you will get it, but it's not necessarily the case. Some people, as we know, will not get symptoms. And if you have another condition, if you happen to have diabetes or hypertension, if you get COVID, it may be worse. And so as a society, do we then, what do we do in our actions to shield the people who may be worse off? And I think in terms of how I imagine our society changing, is an opportunity for us to remember how what we do as individuals connects with what others do. And it can be in a positive way. It doesn't have to be in a negative way. It could be in a positive way. The other day, I opened my door, and it was in the middle of the lockdown, and there were and someone had left. There was a loaf of bread outside the door, and it was warm. And one of my neighbors must have baked it. I had no idea who it was. There was no note because no response was expected, but it was just that gift of giving. Why I'm using this example is that this is something that I've heard from the same story I've heard from others of how they felt the need to connect and reach out to others. And it makes them feel good as well to do that positive action. And we need to remember that and move away from that sort of extractive where we somehow we structure society where when we get something, that's when we feel better. So it's a moving away from the extraction to actually sharing. And I like to think that post-COVID, we have the opportunity to become more of a sharing society, global society, where we know that whatever happens, be it in the most remote corner of the earth, if there are inequalities, if health is an issue there, we need to support to overcome those issues, because actually when we don't share, it eventually comes back to us anyway. And so the way we've lived our lives is crumbling around the edges. We've had to change so much, and that creates that opportunity. So instability I see as these moments of flux as opportunities to remake, to guide to some element that works better for us as human beings.
That's really beautiful. And I think that, let's say I hope that that moment of crisis is not a moment where narrow expertise kind of become the single kind of, sort of mode of addressing an issue. I think that hearing you, Precious, it seems to me that, we are at a moment where we understand that perhaps there is no even a post-COVID, perhaps there is a kind of a life with COVID or COVID-like viruses. Perhaps the vulnerability and exposure and interconnectivity is going to make human life deal with that reality for a long time, even if there's a vaccine here. And that a time of emergency is a time where people somehow become single issue and address the question through one of its aspects. But an intersectional approach that would say that we need to address that issue through the change of our environment, through changing the way in which we are relating to each other, the way we live, the way we organize the relation between us and the countryside, between cities, the way in which we move through space, the way in which we consume, what we eat, how our relation to nature, to animals, is going to be rearticulated. And it seems to me that only an intersectional approach that kind of sees in this moment a possible future through this vulnerability, a way in which we must reconfigure the parameters of our culture, the parameters of our built environment, parameters of our consumption habits, of our life, of our digital culture, is what is important. And conceive a world out of that crisis that is different, is much more relational, much less extractive, like you say, that understands that there is, that there is not a digital domain that is not physical already. That the mental well-being is not disconnected from the physical mental, from the economical one. And also all those issues that have to do with, all justice-related issues, human rights, civil rights, racial equality and equity, etc., are part of that problem that need to be addressed in a kind of completely holistic manner, rather than say, okay, now we're all silent and we need to deal with one aspect of this pandemic. This pandemic is kind of like an opening into a future.
Yes.
That is precisely conversations like that between strangers in disciplines and in life that can open up or unlock that possible future.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. That really resonates with me, and I wonder, when you look at cities, for example, are we going to have more green spaces? Because actually, when we are outside, we can interact with our neighbors. And when we spend more time outside, when there's pollution, we notice it because we've slowed right down. And I think people living in cities during that lockdown period realized what it was like to breathe in clean air, for example, because there were not so many cars. And that in turn has an impact on on greenhouse emissions, etc. So working together is really the only way we can tackle this. We can't create a vacuum where we just look at list we have to tackle. If we say, for example, we have to tackle COVID, and if someone has coronavirus symptoms, they should stay at home and not go to work. The questions that keeps coming to me is, okay, so when we live in a gig economy where if you don't work, you don't get any salary, how are you then going to pay your rent or the food on your table? So if we're saying we want to stop transmission, for example, that means that person who may be symptomatic, we have to provide them with a support structure that will enable them to do the right things for the rest of the community. So already we've gone from health to connecting it to social security.
Yeah, universal basic income.
Exactly. And so I wonder whether, are we going to accelerate that trend towards universal basic income? And at the same time, with more automation, there are people who are possibly no longer in work. What happens to them? So in as much as we're grappling with with the virus, but the virus seems to it's as if we press the fast forward button on things that were happening anyway. So we have to deal with them in a more rapid, in a shorter time frame.
And it's similar to to your demand for more green spaces in cities. And I'd argue that we have now on the dry surface of the earth one city. I mean, we tended to think about cities as kind of dispersed geographically, but both sprawl and interconnectivity somehow made a certain kind of urban planetary system, a kind of a planetary city with open spaces in between, some forests that are still left, some lakes or oceans, some deserts within that. But we need to understand that if our survival is based on our relation to what is unbuilt, what we used to call nature, as what we imagine as this untouched area, it doesn't exist anymore. It's kind of like parks, right? That the forest could be as big as it is, but still a park that is managed. to a certain extent. We need to find a way to think about that relation and to preserve it, because if we don't, there is simply no outside to the social reality in which we are. And I think that the issue that you mentioned, that a complete transformation of our economy, our relation to work, to ask what is work, and who, in what way contribution to culture, to conversation, to if work is about maintaining the interaction between people, by being in connection, one creates value. There's been a lot of discussion on the digital economy, how value is connected simply by clicking, by liking, by sending posts, etc. We increase somehow the collective intellect that is now being siphoned and owned by few corporations, few mega-rich individuals. But if we do think of it as the property of humanity rather than of those particular companies or individuals, we understand that is labor. And labor, we need to be able to reward different kinds of labor. We need to be able to reward life for its being. And the economy, the relationship between work and pay needs to be transformed if we are to survive that particular viral crisis and whatever other viral crises are coming immediately after, I suppose.
Yeah, and how we, are, the people who support, the carers in the community, the nurses, when you look at how we compensate them, and yet the care, that connection to another human being, is one of the most important aspects that we need. And its social value in terms of dealing, supporting people, encouraging mental wellness, reducing loneliness is so important. And over the years, we have sort of, I guess, rejected that. But I could go on, and I think actually we're coming over our time. So
yeah, great speaking to you, Precious. I hope we continue.
I hope so too.
Good luck for